Beneath the endless gray northern sky, in the silence of winter forests, small clusters of wooden barracks stand ringed with barbed wire. These lonely outposts were the first Soviet labor camps, places that in the years after 1917 quietly began to imprison and break thousands of lives. At first they were few and nearly secret, a pale shadow behind the upheaval of the Russian Revolution. Yet those early camps were destined to become the roots of a vast system. Over decades, millions of people would pass through their gates, toiling in forests and mines and construction sites, bound by chains of terror and exhaustion. This is the story of that system, the Gulag, and what life inside its frozen reach was like. It is a calm and unflinching telling, one that searches the memory of forests and barracks with a steady gaze, so that the quiet lessons may be learned and never forgotten. For centuries, Russia had used forced labor to punish prisoners. Under the Tsar, criminals deemed dangerous, thieves, murderers, or political rebels, were sent to work in Siberian katorga camps or on remote mining colonies. The new Soviet Union inherited this brutal tradition, but the communists expanded it for their own revolutionary ends. In 1919, as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, they quietly passed a decree to create forced labor camps across the country. Initially, these camps were meant to hold the so-called enemies of the people, old regime officials, rich peasants, or political opponents. Often, any village preacher or former aristocrat could find himself sent there on a fabricated charge. One of the first and most infamous was Solovetsky Camp, established in 1920 on a windswept island monastery in the White Sea. Prisoners there, a mix of priests, intellectuals, and soldiers from the old Civil War, awoke one morning to find their monastery gates locked behind them and barbed wire festooning the outer walls. Thus began their long sentence: winter ice, roads, tree felling, and hand digging at the edge of Europe. By the early 1920s, Solovetsky and a few other camps became the core of a northern network of prisons run by the Cheka, the new secret police, known for a time as Slan, northern camps of special significance. In those years, the Soviet leadership was experimenting with the idea of re-education through labor, a concept advocated by some Bolsheviks. Men who had once been party officials or Red Army commanders sometimes ended up in these camps simply for having fallen afoul of shifting politics. Word of the work was not spread in newspapers. It was whispered from person to person, a secret known to mothers and sons alone. Back in towns, people began to speak about the unknown island of Solovki, or the special camps, aware that behind such euphemisms lived their missing neighbors. As the 1920s progressed, the number of camps grew slowly but steadily. They were scattered in the woods of the Urals, in the steppes of Kazakhstan, by the Arctic Circle near rail junctions. Usually they were very basic: wooden barracks heated by a single iron stove, ramshackle workshops, an office or two for the guards, and high fences all around. The first prisoners labored clearing fields or cutting timber. Children in nearby orphanages would stare at the long lines of shivering men marching to work. Under V. I. Lenin's leadership, these camps were still relatively small, a few thousand prisoners across the entire system by the late 1920s. But they served as a dark laboratory for methods that would later be applied on a grand scale. That scale came with Joseph Stalin's rise. In 1929, Stalin announced his first 5-year plan, a campaign to rapidly industrialize the Soviet economy. It required unimaginable manpower. Politically, Stalin's regime also insisted on rooting out any remnants of class enemies. With both goals in mind, the Soviet leadership chose to formalize and vastly expand the camp network. In 1930, they created the Main Camp Administration, known by its Russian acronym Gulag, to administer virtually all camps nationwide. The new system ran under the NKVD, the Internal Police Force. A single order could send a man from a provincial town to a camp thousands of miles away. Suddenly, camps appeared everywhere. Forests around Moscow saw the building of a giant canal by mere trenches. In the Far East, construction of a new railroad began under the pickaxes of inmates. Prisoners were now no longer just one class or another. Criminals and political detainees mixed in a single penitentiary stream. A peasant who resisted giving up his farm might be arrested along with a city banker accused of sabotage. By 1934, estimates show the Gulag held hundreds of thousands at once. Within 2 years, as collectivization uprooted millions of peasants, it held well into the millions. The very nature of Soviet society had changed. Most citizens now harbored a secret fear that a casual word might label them counter-revolutionary. Parents ensured their children were never overheard criticizing the state. In churchyard whispers, townspeople told each other how so-and-so had been taken by the GPU after a midnight knock. Each knock might bring a trembling wife to a well-wrapped window pane, hoping her husband would not be among those hauled away. The camps began to be seen as a normal, if horrific, part of life in the Stalinist era. By 1937 to 1938, the worst of the Great Purge arrived. Arrests hit every level of society: army generals, Communist Party members, professors, and artists. The jails overflowed. The Gulag, already mighty, swelled even further. Secret troikas, 3-man courts, ran expedited trials that often lasted only minutes before sentencing. Mail trains rumbled eastwards daily with fresh human cargo. On arrival at a camp in that bitter atmosphere, a prisoner might never even have committed a real crime. Yet his wretched name could now be crossed off the wall of communist honor and written onto a tattered camp roster instead. The broad daylight air of these camps was filled with chains and labor. Each morning before dawn, the guards would knock on the barrack doors, barking to rouse the sleepers. Inmates, bleary-eyed and freezing, dressed in thin cotton shirts and tattered woolens, often with rags for shoes. Breakfast was assembled in buckets, a hunk of dark rye bread, and a ladleful of watery cabbage soup. If the prisoner had earned extra labor that day, he might find a few morsels of fish or a spoonful of groats. But most days it was only bread and bruised vegetables. After roll call, the long column of prisoners marched out to the worksite through snow and frost, flanked by patrols of armed NKVD men. The work itself was merciless. With rusty axes and frozen pickaxes, they toiled until their joints ached. Some days meant heaving buckets of gravel at a new canal, others dragging logs from the forest. Under the gloomy sky of midwinter, muscles reddened under frostbite as men raised fences or dug foundations. A camp might expect 10 to 12 hours of labor. If darkness came and the quotas were not met, work continued by starlight. The commissars of the NKVD had no patience for any lag. Any prisoner who dared move too slowly risked a club to the spine or worse. Grievously injured men were not spared. They were simply expected to keep working, or if collapsing, to remain silent. Lunch was as brief as it was meager, another scoop of thin soup and maybe some black bread. Then the line fell back into work formation for the afternoon. A hush fell over the camp forest, broken only by the sound of shovels or axes. Prisoners held a new world inside their heads to keep from feeling hunger. Perhaps a remembered lullaby from childhood, or a family name carved deep into the side of a bucket for all to see. But inside, each man's stomach throbbed relentlessly. They worked not to build the city of tomorrow, but merely to survive today. At sunset, even the cruel forest light surrendered to darkness. Then the prisoners, weakened and often on the brink of collapse, were marched back to the camp. As cold winds bit their faces, another roll call waited. Half-frozen men stood rigidly in the snow for minutes, sometimes an hour, as the guard sergeant called out names to make sure no one had died on the way. Only after this could they finally return to eat and sleep. By that time, it was late evening, and what food was left was an even gruel poured from an iron pot into tin bowls. In the heart of the barracks, men would eat by dull lamplight, sharing among comrades a few spoonfuls of grain. Even the crumbs seemed precious. The prison barracks themselves were stark. Rows of bunks clattered across wide wooden floors. Some camps stacked 5 or 6 men on each shelf. Each man had maybe half a meter to curl up for the night. The roof might leak in spring, or in winter those leaking cracks turned to ice. Of smoke, it kept perhaps one corner of smoke. It kept perhaps one corner tolerable, while the rest of the hall remained almost as cold as outside. To pass the night, prisoners would huddle together. Some wore all their clothes to bed. Talk was minimal. Many closed their eyes quickly, riding the drug of fatigue, though sleep was thin. The smell of pine and wet fur coats mingled with that of salty sweat as men shivered under thin blankets. Even in sleep, the mind seldom rested. Dreams came of home cooking or a child's laughter, only to be chased away by the harsh tick of an early morning guard. The wounds of hunger and cold were legion. The lucky few who recovered from the day's labor might awaken the next morning. Another cycle, to find themselves with a body weaker than before. Colds and fevers spread like wildfire in the overfilled sleeping halls. It was said that nearly half of the camp population at any time might be sick, coughing blood from bronchitis or gasping under feverish chills. The camp hospital, a cold barrack with a few bunks, offered little relief. Beside a thin cloth curtain, a single doctor and some orderlies did what they could. A bit of hot tea, a bandage change, perhaps a dose of codeine. But soon the doctor's list might be full, and others would be sent back to work simply because the rice ran out or deadlines had to be met. Discipline was brutal and absolute. When quotas were not met, punitive measures began. A slow worker might be sent to a carcer cell, a small concrete hole with a wooden shelf, no light, no heat, until he fully compensated. These punishment cells were dreaded as a deathly torment. To be placed there was to know one would emerge on crutches or not at all. Criminal underworld gangs in the camps also enforced their own cruel rules. Some prisoners recalled that experienced convicts would poke a beaten man until he was sure to sing for them or force quarrels just to snatch what little food was left. There were tales of prisoners betting with rifle triggers and threats whispered in the darkness. By the late 1940s, these criminal groups had established a strange parallel society. Bosses with men sworn to thieves' laws carried out the guards' orders by fear, and the guard bosses rarely interfered since the prisoners kept order for them. The differences among prisoners extended beyond the yard. Generally, one could separate the inmates into two broad categories: the common criminals, thieves, murderers, robbers, who had committed real crimes, and the so-called political prisoners, people convicted of disagreeing with the state. Inside, the distinction was vital. Guards and criminals alike had no sympathy for the intellectuals or officials who found themselves in the camps. A political prisoner might be someone who once taught school or wrote poems. Now he wore the same faded coat and starved just as his next-door neighbor did. But that neighbor, if he had a criminal past, might soon bully the former teacher for better rations. Political prisoners had often been used to respect. Suddenly, in the Gulag, they learned that the only hierarchy was strength and brutality. Some cruel guards felt no need to hide their contempt. One group of new inmates recalled hearing other prisoners exchange the coarsest curses about them as they walked to work, a disgrace unnoticed by the soldiers. In a harsh reversal, those who once held positions of power found themselves vulnerable. Yet even here, some seeds of solidarity persisted. An educated man might quietly teach his barrack mates to read or share precious knowledge of medicine. Allies formed not by rank or creed, but by simple shared humanity. Despite all this, the spirit can carry on. In the dim dawn and late dusk, many found unexpected ways to keep their minds alive. One prisoner would, during moments of rest, replay an entire symphony in his head, note by note, to blot out the noise of toil. A few smuggled pieces of charcoal or pencil into their tins and wrote jokes or sketches on the bench, occasionally passing them to a friend to make a secret smile. The bitterest hunger sometimes turned into a grim contest of who could stand it longer, a person betting his last bread crust he could last 3 more nights. Sometimes nights went by in hushed conspiracy. 2 men might whisper stanzas from a poet's verse one remembered, fortifying each other with the beauty of words. One churchman, freed after Stalin died, later recalled the survivors at the Canal Project, calling softly from their bunks for the mealtime blessing, as if to comfort an entire hall of strangers at once. Some clung to faith in any form. Though preaching was forbidden, priests and believers gathered quietly. One former monk in the Gulag said he spent long nights reading fragments of the gospel copied onto any scrap of paper, then chewing it with crushed bread, a wretched communion, but still a ritual. Others knelt by their bunks and whispered a childhood prayer. The guards usually turned a blind eye as long as the acts were hushed. Sometimes they even appreciated singing prisoners for propaganda. But often, a clandestine prayer gave a prisoner a sense of kinship with something larger than the camp. For instance, on bitter nights, some would pray not that they might live, but that their soul might not be broken. To think of life beyond those barbed wire fences, of free air, sun, and the taste of warm bread, became a survival technique. They survived mentally by imagining a day in the summer when they walked home. Such dreams were the chains that kept the mind from snapping. Still, the psychological toll was enormous. Not everyone found comfort in recollections. In the darkest minds, despair grew heavy. Some men lost the will to eat even the meager rations, sometimes causing camp doctors to intervene, only to record them dead. Others snapped at cruelty and became stoic, finishing work through mental exhaustion and staring through days. A few took to composing self-help chants. One more step, you are free tomorrow, though tomorrow often turned out to be another day in line. The fear of punishment or sudden transport never left any prisoner's heart. Some carried guilt for things they hadn't done, anger at lost time with families, or simply the blank numbness that comes from living under constant threat. Suicides in camps did happen, though always hidden or attributed to illness. Each was a silent scream against the void. Yet even in their silence, they testified to how unbearable the life could be. Through all this, a kind of brittle social order grew, a mix of law and desperation. Among the prisoners, small freedoms were fought for. A group might quietly agree to take turns grabbing the largest share of soup so that others survived. An informal, communal pot tradition. Tumosuhi's engineer might exchange technical advice for a chunk of bread. On journeys, prisoners called Sabbatnik groups, sometimes Jews on Saturdays, Muslims on their holy days, might discreetly sit out work for a day, risking punishment because religion was still important to them. Children who ended up in camps, often born to imprisoned mothers, received care from women who banded together, teaching them to make dolls from rags for comfort. Meanwhile, the state took note. It assigned odd jobs to literate prisoners, let some run the barrack post office, a scrap of paper by which prisoners could mail words to the outside world, or even counted lightly on older men to keep discipline quietly. Thus, inside each camp, despite chains and guards, a different society existed on its own terms, a society of scarcity where trust was rare but sometimes life-saving. The Soviet economy drew heavily on this captive workforce, though Gulag prisoners never made up more than a few percent of the national labor pool. They accounted for far higher fractions as in certain sectors. By the late 1940s, roughly 1 in 5 construction workers in the USSR was a prisoner. Vast forests were felled for canals, and mines ran deeper thanks to their hands. For example, the White Sea-Baltic Canal was built almost entirely by Gulag labor in just 2 years, 1931 to 32. It linked the White Sea to the Baltic and boasted 33 locks in its short length, but at an appalling cost. Reports of the time claim tens of thousands died building it. The Soviet propaganda of that era praised it as a miracle of communist efficiency. Many former prisoners remembered it as a graveyard. Later, Gulag labor carved the Volga-Don Canal between the Don and Volga rivers and helped expand the industrial city of Magnitogorsk. In the far northeast, in the biting cold of Kolyma, a network of camps and a government trust called Dalstroy ran gold mines, and all but wholly relied on the captive workforce. The idea was that prisoners could be paid near starvation wages, or none at all, thus generating a large surplus for the state. In other words, the state was extracting resources for almost no outlay. This always ran up against reality. Living costs within the camps, not to mention death rates, were extremely high. Internal Soviet calculations sometimes showed that in certain projects, the prisoners' output barely exceeded the grain and supplies poured into their belly buckets. Yet no one in power complained, because every gulag meter of track or every cubic meter of wood dug out was billed to some 5-year plan. If a forest road was built through labor, any failures could be blamed on the local guards or bad planning. In pragmatic terms, the gulag was kept because it reduced unemployment and gave the illusion of a labor glut. As Stalin once reportedly said, the camps were a fortress of the revolution, and even after the worst purges, the fortress walls remained up for 2 more decades. In this quiet, absurd economy, a prison camp seemed to be its own frozen little factory town. Dozens of inmates could be kept busy in a tailor shop making uniforms, or in a lathe workshop turning gun barrels, or in carpentry shops carving desks for the state. One prisoner who knew how to fix a stove might spend a year in the camp keeping all the heaters working. The camps even had small farms, where trained farmers grew enough food to eke out the barest part of the diet for everyone. All this was state property, owned by the internal security ministries. But in truth, the main commodity of each camp was human suffering. The liberation each project achieved on maps and in 5-year plans was paid for with lives and shattered health. Life inside was a constellation of punishments and small mercies, with one fact standing above all: hunger. Food governed everything. A prisoner often rose only to eat and sleep. Most who worked honestly never saw anything beyond the first or second level of rations. That could mean 300 to 500 grams of bread at breakfast and a pinch of groats for supper, as long as quotas were met. There were stories of men pushing themselves beyond quotas just to be allotted the smallest extra meat broth. Those who failed to meet the quotas, however, would sometimes have their soup cut and bread rationed away until they worked harder. The camp economy rewarded overachievement in a bleak way. If you achieved 125% of the norm, you might be slotted into the best line for food, getting a few extra spoonfuls of groats or a bit more soup. Very few ever reached 125%. It was rumored the only way was by some minimal cheating or illegal slowing of others. The end result was that nearly everyone, including those who worked diligently, nearly starved. Prisoners quickly learned that every scrap mattered. Bread wrappers were burned to warm hands. Pea soup skins scraped for more nutrition, and snow sometimes melted for water. Disease and undernourishment took an enormous toll. In winter, guards could sometimes hear coughing from outside yards. Men told of bodies piled in carts to be dumped into mass graves every autumn. Living with such poverty and pain, people turned inward. With no choice but to endure, some prisoners reported practicing an almost Zen-like survival, focusing only on the step in front, the breath in the lungs. Others sat by the stove and silently recited lines of Pushkin until the words burned themselves into memory. Some fell to their knees each night in silent prayer, most often for the faint hope that when their labor was done, or one day abandoned by guards, they might walk back home. Indeed, though the daily routines inside the camps were the unsung terror of millions, the human soul found ways to carry on, learning, remembering, and sometimes forgiving themselves and God just to keep living. As Soviet years rolled into the 1950s, the Gulag persisted, but in slowly dwindling form. After Stalin's death in 1953, a wave of releases swept over the camps. Up to 2 million people were freed in the first few years, as convicted thieves got amnesties and political prisoners saw new reviews. By 1956, the government itself admitted many had been unjustly jailed. The secret police agency that ran the Gulag was reorganized and its worst camps closed. Life under Khrushchev brought relaxations not only in politics, but in prisons. Tools improved, stoves burned brighter, and work norms were tempered. Many surviving inmates finally returned home, blinking in the strange sunshine of a world that had moved on. The large, factory-like Gulag, once called the engine of Soviet modernization, had been dismantled. Even so, the system's shadow lingered. The Soviet Union continued to imprison people, just without the name Gulag. The new camps and labor colonies of later decades held fewer political dissenters, but still kept criminals and any determined agitator in harsh confinement. Those who spoke out against the regime in the 1960s and 70s, for example, writing uncensored literature or publicly defending human rights, sometimes found themselves sent not to Siberia's mines, but to other remote camps or even psychiatric hospitals. These acts were far lower in scale than the purges of old, but for the individuals involved, the experience could still be cruel and dehumanizing. In one telling shift, the Soviet government began treating prominent dissidents as idiots or threats to be brainwashed in asylums, a different form of Gulag on a smaller map. It was in the following decades that the outside world slowly learned the full story. Through the 1960s and beyond, some Soviet citizens spoke cautiously about the camps, often under their breath. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives opened up. Scholars and survivors began to tally the human tolls. With documents now accessible, historians affirmed that tens of millions had passed through these camps over the decades, and at least 1 million died in them. Some estimates put it higher. These horrifying facts took the world by storm. The Gulag was laid bare not with anger, but with a quiet resolve to know the truth. Gradually, monuments and museums arose to remember. In 1995, the former Perm camp in the Urals was opened to the public as a museum of political repression. Visitors can now walk the original fence lines and bunk rooms where prisoners lived. The Gulag History Museum in Moscow compiled artifacts and testimonies, creating an archives center in the 2000s so families could search for their lost kin. In 2017, Russia even erected a modest wall of sorrow in the capital, a stone slab inscribed with millions of names, a quiet place for candles and flowers. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, writers produced books and films telling calm, personal stories about camp life. Today, the barracks stand empty, and the fences have rusted. Bears now roam through what was once an entire archipelago of work sites. Rivers have washed clear the old canal beds, and weeds up to a man's waist cover the frozen trenches. The countryside shows its scars in subtle ways. A small village sprouted next to a prison railway, towns named after revolutionary heroes that once held political prisoners have square statues of Lenin, and the communities hold days of remembrance when survivors walk slowly among the graves of friends. But in everyday life, the Gulag is something most people no longer think about for very long. Even in Russia, younger generations know little of it unless they encounter it in school books or museums. And so we speak of it now with calm respect. The story of these labor camps does not need anger to convey its truth. Its facts stand silent as stones. The long nights, the endless frost, the whispers among comrades, the quietly recited poems and prayers. In that spirit, this history is told not to inflame, but to instruct. We remember the victims' lives with gentle solemnity, lighting candles in memory rather than shouting slogans. In the hush of winter, among the birches and overgrown tracks, the past is allowed to speak softly. These were human beings who survived on hope and kindness in the bleakest of places. We tell their story in the quietest possible voice, so that the terrible lesson of the Gulag lingers gently in our minds, not as a call to hatred, but as a compassionate warning to cherish freedom and humanity in every age.